Bentwaters, England, 1956. Radar operators at multiple Air Force bases track objects traveling over 4,000 miles an hour. These objects are seen by people on the ground and in the air. What was witnessed that night? Let's find out in this week's episode, the Lakenheath Bentwaters UFO Incident. It's the Alien Conspiracy Podcast. We are your hosts, Agent ETA and
Agent Anderson. Come along as we examine UFO sightings, conspiracies, and all things strange. Follow the show on Twitter at AlienConPod. But first, it's time for Strange Events, Bizarre Facts, the Unbelievable Revealed. This is the Mind Boggle of the Week. The Alcubierre Drive. In 1994, theoretical physicist Dr. Miguel Alcubierre proposed an engine that could travel faster than the speed of light. Einstein's theory of relativity puts a hard limit on space travel. The faster something goes, the more energy it needs to accelerate. Actually going the speed of light requires an infinite amount of energy. If it's impossible to go as fast as light, even faster should be impossible too. That is, unless a very clever scientist figures out how it can be done. Dr. Alcubierre really thought outside the box on this one. Instead of making bigger rockets to fight the laws of physics, we can achieve faster than light speed travel by bending space-time around a ship, creating a warp bubble. The ship would stay in one place while the universe moved around it. It sounds like something from a TV show, but the science checks out. The problem is, creating a warp bubble requires exotic matter with a negative energy density. We aren't sure if this type of matter can exist in our universe. Dr. Alcubierre suggested the Casimir vacuum between parallel plates could be used as a negative energy, but you'll have to ask him about it because I have no idea what that is. Will a scientific breakthrough soon allow travel between the stars? Is it possible that a more advanced civilization has discovered how to cheat the rules of the universe? What would it be like to travel faster than the speed of light without actually doing so? It boggles the mind. And now it's time for the show.
All right, so the Bentwaters UFO incident. It's a pretty cool incident. There's a lot of different data points involved with it. There's a lot of different testimonies from people to draw off of. I think it's a very interesting story. It's one that more people should hear about. So I think it's important to state the political scenery that was around in 1956, especially with England. There was a lot of different things that they were involved in. They were the first nation to install ground radar across an entire section of the country. So that they have been involved in radar since the beginning of ground radar. At least they know what they're doing. They know what they're looking at. They've had experience for many years. But 1956, this was at the beginning of the Cold War, towards the beginning, but it's still very, very high tensions in that area because some of those bases were used for different surveillance programs and stuff by the United States and by England. I think it's important to note that if anything in those areas of those Air Force bases was noticed by radar and thought to have been as odd, they most certainly would have scrambled airplanes to check it out at the very least.
So let's start with the first. The first sighting was at about 9 o'clock at the Royal Air Force Base at Bentwaters in England, in Suffolk, England.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing they noticed was a group of slow radar targets. They saw them on a slow course to the northeast. They sent a jet out to investigate what these targets were, but it had to return to base because it accidentally lost its external fuel tanks. So the jet was not able to actually go out and investigate what these slow-moving targets were. There were about a dozen or more targets, and in front of them, there were 3 targets in a triangular formation. And they were moving 80 to 125 miles an hour. and that's it's an interesting speed because there are not really aircraft don't really fly at that speed, and at the same
Hmm.
time, if you look at like the wind data, and it couldn't have been a bunch of balloons or something because balloons wouldn't have been going at that speed at that altitude either. So they weren't really quite sure what it was.
So at 9:30, there were the radar operators at the was it the Bentwaters base? I believe was the one that happened at 9:30.
Yeah, it's still
Right.
at Bentwaters.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Okay, so at 9:30, there were radar operators at Bentwaters that tracked a target that looked what they claimed it looked normal. A normal aircraft return is the term that I read as far as what they were seeing on the radar screens,
Mhm.
and it was approaching the base from the sea, and the speed that they mention here is just astronomical. It was several thousand miles per hour, which at that point and at this point at current time, there's no aircraft that I know of that can go that fast,
Yeah,
right?
I actually spent quite a lot. Most of my research time actually was spent trying to find any sort of craft we had that could travel at these speeds at these altitudes. So we have like
Hmm.
we know about the SR-71 that can go, over Mach 3, but it can't do that at ground level. It has to go so far in the atmosphere that it's basically in space to travel that fast because there's so much air friction. And even that high up, there's so much air friction that it causes the skin to basically glow red. There's so much,
Hmm.
that's really, really fast for something to be traveling.
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. And what was it supposed to be between? Was that the one that was between 2,000 and 4,000 miles an hour?
That one, I think it was over 4,000 miles an hour.
Okay, yeah. Which, yeah, it's absolutely amazing. Those slow moving targets are also important to note too, because correct me if I'm wrong, but those are the ones that they scrambled planes to or jets, the Venom jets
Yeah,
trainers were they or?
they scrambled the one that couldn't make it, but they also scrambled another one to go look at it. But
Mhm.
they didn't scramble that one until at least as far as from what I have until about 9:30. They sent a pilot from the 512th Squad to look for the targets, and he went
Mhm.
over. He didn't see anything, so they sent one jet that couldn't make it because of the fuel tanks again. But the second jet
Mhm.
went over there. They didn't see anything. They reported a bright amber star-like object low on the horizon, but this is generally most people agree that that was probably Mars. By the way, it didn't do anything weird. It didn't move around or anything. It was just a bright
Mhm.
amber light, and the way the pilot described it, it was it was almost certainly Mars, and he probably
Mhm.
reported it that because they sent him to look for something, and that's the only thing he saw, so he reported it.
So that's what he reported.
Yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense. So when the first set of airplanes, the first one that had gone out, lost its fuel tank, had come back, and they scrambled up two more. When those guys went up, those pilots didn't see, they didn't have any visual contact at that point, right?
yeah. But this whole time, they still have the cluster of targets on the radar, which is
Hmm. The slow moving ones, right?
yeah, which is kind of weird that they have these radar returns, but the pilots can't actually find it, even though they're directed to where it is.
Hmm.
So the target cluster traveled slowly to about 40 miles northeast of Bentwaters. Then the individual targets converged into a single point that was it was a radar return that was much larger than any aircraft that we ever had, even to this
Hmm.
day. We don't have an aircraft. If it was several times the size of like a bomber, I forget which one, but
Hmm. And it's also, I think we should note real quick that there was a meteor shower that lasted from the 11th to the 13th, which is one thing that people often bring up as an explanation for these observations that people were making. But as people will find out, the way that these blips or registrations, whatever they're called on the radar, the way that they're acting wouldn't have nothing to do with how a meteorite acts. I mean, a meteor is going to be going in a straight line, right? And it's not going to be going parallel to the ground.
Yeah.
That's for sure, right?
Yeah, we can, if you look at the actual data, you can pretty much completely rule out meteors as a possibility because, like you're saying, first of all, meteors don't travel parallel to the ground. Second of all, the meteors that we're talking about, I believe, were the Perseid meteor shower, and they come from a very specific direction in the sky, and that's not the direction that these radar targets were traveling. And another point is that meteors travel very, very fast, like 200,000 miles an hour, like really fast.
Yes.
And that's why they burn up in the atmosphere almost immediately. They
because of friction.
Yeah, they almost never reach the ground. And if they did reach the ground, if they were big enough to reach the ground, they would leave a very large crater, you know?
And and they also don't group up and become one object on the radar screens either.
Right, yeah.
Or do any of the other strange things that we're going to describe in a little bit here. So the next event that took place, from what I understand, was at 2255. Was that correct?
Yeah. But wait, the slow targets, I forgot to mention the slow targets. So after they converged into that large point, it was actually stationary on the radar for about 10 minutes.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Before it started to move again to the northeast, and then it paused for 5 more minutes. And then after that, it left the radar scope entirely, and then they lost it off of the scope. But again, like a meteor is not going to do that. It's not going to start and stop. It's just going to burn up or hit the ground.
Yeah, nothing about what they were observing would say that it was a meteor at all.
Yeah,
for sure, by the way it's behaving. So the next time that they had an observation on the radar was at 1055, right? And that was another fast-moving object that was approaching Bentwaters from the east. And that's right. That's the speed that was between 2,000 and 4,000 miles an hour.
Yeah. Oh,
as he observed it.
I don't know if we said, but geographically, if you can picture the island of England, what we're talking about are bases on the southeast part of the island. So you have like the English Channel, I think, right there. You have like the island, then some water, and then you have Europe. So these targets are coming from the area that's water between England and Europe on the south side of England.
They're coming from a direction that would give them a good cause for concern. All right, so at 1055, there was a target that was detected approaching Bentwaters from the east. And the speeds that it was traveling was around, between 2,000 and 4,000 miles an hour. And it's another pretty, obvious thing. If you see something traveling that fast on a radar screen, it's going to catch your attention, right?
Yeah, and the really interesting thing about this particular one is that people in the tower saw a bright streak of light flying overhead. So not all of these radar targets had visual witnesses, but this one, the people in the tower saw it flying overhead, and at the same time that they saw it flying overhead, somebody in an airplane flying at about 4,000 feet over the Air Force Base also saw it flying underneath of them. So we have a definite visual sighting from the ground and the air, and we can confirm that it was at a very low altitude. It was because the people in the airplane saw it flying underneath of them. And if you're not familiar with aviation terms, when you're flying on a jumbo jet, let's say you're flying from Los Angeles to New York or wherever you're going, they tend to cruise at about, let's say, 30,000 to 50,000 feet. So if you're flying at like 4,000 feet or lower than 4,000 feet, that's a very low elevation to be flying at. That's not very high up at all. If you saw a plane flying that low, you would think to yourself that this plane is flying unusually low. So at this point in the evening, the Royal Air Force Base at Lakenheath gets a call from Bentwaters from their radar unit asking if they saw any targets traveling over 4,000 miles an hour, because the targets were actually headed, when they passed over Bentwaters, over their radar area, they were headed towards the Lakenheath base. So
Mm-hmm.
they called him up and asked
That
him.
base is about 40 miles away to the northwest, correct?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's really close. So they called him up and they're asking him if he saw it, because they would have seen it really, going 4,000 miles an hour. They would have seen it pretty quickly. So they called him up to
Mm-hmm.
see if they had seen it. Um, so that there were reports that the target had passed directly over Skullthorpe Air Force Base that was actually manned by the United States Air Force. That was a station. Their tower had seen the object, but Lakenheath had not. And the Skullthorpe reported that they had seen like a blurry light, which is pretty much exactly what they reported at Bentwaters.
Mm-hmm.
And at the Skullthorpe base, a C-47 that was flying over that base at about 5,000 feet said that they saw it fly below them.
So Lakenheath reported stationary targets on their radar screen, and they had sent up a couple different jets to intercept. Is that correct?
Yeah, at first they didn't see anything on their radar scopes, but then they saw a
Okay.
stationary target, and they actually had two different radars that saw the target.
Well, I was going to say I think it's important to note that they were using different types of radar. There were multiple different frequencies that they were using with the radar. So, because a lot of people talk about how it could have been just a glitch in the system. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
A glitch in the matrix. But it's very important for people to know that there was multiple different types of radar systems that were being implemented at that time. So it wasn't something that was just like the same system had a glitch throughout the whole thing. It wasn't the same system.
Yeah. The target was still at first. It didn't move around, but then it started to move around the area at high speeds in a rectilinear pattern. It would abruptly start and stop. So it wouldn't accelerate and it wouldn't decelerate. It would just move and then not move. Observers in the
Mhm.
area on the base saw round white lights that matched the radar targets. The people at the base set up a conference call with various higher ups, like the muckety mucks, and they decided to launch an intercept. They sent two jets from the Royal Air Force to go investigate the area. It remained stationary while they were approaching it. When they were within half a mile from the target, one of the pilots said, "Roger, Lakenheath, I've got my guns locked on him." He paused, and then he said, "Where did he go? Do you still have him?" The tower reported
Mhm.
that the target had gone behind the jet. The jet had only forward radar, so he didn't see it at this point. It was pretty
Mhm.
much invisible to the jet.
And it had disappeared from his radar within a split second, right?
Yeah, it was there and then it wasn't. It didn't
Mhm.
it's not like it was moving like a normal jet would move or a normal aircraft would move. It was there and then it just disappeared. So the tower reported that the target had gone behind the jet and it was sticking right behind him. So the jet climbed, dove, it moved every possible maneuver he could think of to try to shake the thing off of his tail. But no matter what he did, it always stayed right behind him. After about 10 minutes, the jet ran out of fuel or ran really low on fuel, so he had to return to base. The UFO followed the jet for a short distance, but then it stopped and remained stationary once again. The second jet that was scrambled to go investigate this experienced a malfunction and was not able to intercept the target, so they had to return to base. So only one jet was able to go, unfortunately, because if there's two jets there, then maybe the second one would have been able to observe the object behind him, but unfortunately that didn't happen.
Mhm. Yeah, they could have fell back and at least tried to get on their tail.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a weird situation because a lot of the excuses that you hear, like how some people say, oh, they were observing Mars or they were observing meteors that were coming in, and none of those things are going to act like this.
Yeah.
Well, something was up there. You know what I mean? Something was there that they were observing. They were reacting to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, nothing.
It's just
Ball lightning doesn't do this, meteors don't do this, radar mirages don't do this, nothing does this. It's just so weird.
yeah. There's nothing that I know of personally that does this. Something obviously what we're theorizing what it is potential aliens or UFOs, whatever the UFO may be, whether it's technology that one of our governments had. That I mean, it's 1956, so I have trouble believing that, right? I mean,
Yeah,
World War II had just happened, like we're talking about, and so there was a lot of technology with aviation that was constantly being, on parade, I guess you'd say,
right.
because they were showing off their prowess, just like the Navy and Navy battleships, aircraft carriers. Anytime a big new aircraft carrier, was built, they would parade it around. I mean, obviously, something like that isn't the type of, craft that you can hide anyways, right? But aircraft are going to be a little bit different because there's more secretive projects in that realm.
Yeah, but I always think, like, if hypothetically speaking, if the Russians had the kind of technology that could do something like this, then they wouldn't
Mhm.
have lost the Cold War, right?
Yeah, yeah, you're right about that. That's a good point. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. If they had, for instance, maybe obtained a alien spacecraft that they learned how to fly, you know what I mean? Like, well, if you subscribe to stuff that, like, for instance, Bob Lazar talks about, that could be a situation, right?
Yeah.
But I digress.
So there's an excerpt from a declassified document. This document was classified as secret. It's
Hmm.
BOI-485, and this is a quote from that document that describes the tail chase incident. Flight path was straight but jerky, with objects stopping instantly and then continuing. Maneuvers were of the same pattern, except one object was observed to lock on to the fighter scrambled by RAF and followed all maneuvers of the jet fighter aircraft. And the reason that's interesting is because this is an official classified document. So we know that this isn't just some anecdote by a pilot that claims something happened to them 50 years ago so they can try to sell a book. This is an
Yeah, they're
actual,
not trying to make some wild claim to get attention.
yeah, this is an actual document that they wrote. They classified it because they didn't want anybody to see it, and then it was much later
Hmm.
declassified.
Well, and it's a bit unfortunate too, because as far as on the British side of things, when it concerns documents, from what I understand, they got rid of pretty much every document relating to this by 1969, I think, because 1969 is when this case became public at first. Is that correct?
I don't remember when it first became public, but I do remember seeing that they did destroy many. Not, I don't think they destroyed all the documents because if they did, we wouldn't have any. But they destroyed
Mm.
most of the documents that were about this particular incident.
Okay, that's what it was then. But just imagine, it's I'm sure there's plenty of situations that share this, but what we could have found out if only we had those documents.
Yeah,
The more complete story, because something like this, there's so many, like we were saying before, there's so many different data points. It can be a little tough to create a full story in your head as far as exactly what happened and what happened while it was everything else. Because like you said, there's multiple bases that were reacting to the same radar blips at the same time. You know what I mean? So if we could get, like, a full story from the whole area, that'd be awesome.
yeah. And what did the general in charge, or whoever was in charge, who had the whole picture? What was it like? What were they seeing? I I
Hmm.
imagine they were probably pretty frightened that we had these targets that we could not intercept and we could
They
not
seem to be
track,
playing with
basically.
us.
That,
Yeah.
yeah, that you launch it.
Well, and like we said before, they were reacting to something,
Yeah,
something worth reacting to.
but that's the thing. They could only, in this situation, they could only react. They couldn't do anything. If this had been some sort of
Hmm.
aircraft that had weapons on it, they would have been completely at its mercy.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, if that whatever that was, if it had ill intent, there's nothing they could do to stop it from doing what it wants to do. That's got to be a
Yeah.
pretty helpless feeling, especially if you're, someone that's in charge of safety on that level. You know what I mean? Or
Mhm.
security.
Yeah. There were reports that a senior officer from the Air Ministry interviewed people that interviewed witnesses that saw things at the different bases and collected reports from them. And he
Hmm.
also told the people not to discuss the incident. But of course, these reports are not available, unfortunately. But witnesses did claim that a higher up interviewed them. So
Mhm.
that despite what they always say, they say, oh, this is nothing, we're not interested, whatever. According to many witnesses, they actually were very interested in what happened, the people who were higher up.
Yeah, they had something that they were concerned about. Yeah, you don't put resources like that, especially if it's yeah, I mean somebody if they have better things to spend their time on, right?
Yeah,
Than looking into this type of thing if they don't have the perspective that it's real,
yeah.
right? So they definitely they have some kind of investment in that investigation. So I know that there were civilians that had claimed that they witnessed some of these events, right?
Yeah, so there was a newspaper article in 1978. They published a newspaper article that talked about the event. And in response to that, a civilian witness came forward. And I wrote down his quote because his description I thought was just completely fascinating. So he said, "I was a witness with others who wished to remain anonymous to the Lakenheath flap of 1956. I have never seen such a panic. From the Prick Willow Road, Ely, we could see searchlights sweeping the sky in every direction. We saw a bright white star-like light speeding low across the fen straight towards us. When the light reached us, it stopped dead. It did not slow down, it just stopped. The light went out, then a bright flash of light, and it shot off on the exact course from which it came, as if on a slack string."
That's a pretty powerful statement if you have the imagination to recreate what he's talking about.
Yeah,
If I would have experienced something like that, I would be I'd be I don't know what the hell I would think. You know, it's something that doesn't it just defies logic in every way. It's something that should never happen. You know, and as you're watching it, you're going to be just dumbfounded. I would be. I would think.
yeah.
You know.
But the really interesting thing is that so this is in 1978, and this is before we have a lot of the documents and witness statements that support what happened. But what he's
Mhm.
describing is pretty much exactly what they're reporting on some of these radar returns. Like it's starting
Oh
and
yeah.
stopping with that acceleration. That
Mhm.
it's moving in like these rectangle patterns and this kind of stuff. So he has a little bit more to his statement. About 10 minutes later, we sat on a wall in New Barnes Avenue opposite the phone box. We looked up and saw almost above us three amber glowing objects, quite low, but enveloped in a cloud, although the night was clear. After a few minutes, the objects began to revolve in a clockwise direction, slowly at first, then much faster, and the objects were swapping places with each other at great speed, and it went straight up and was gone. Now,
Hmm.
this one it doesn't seem necessarily like it matches any of the radar returns, but on the other hand, if you think about how some of these seem to just sort of disappear out of nowhere, if they go straight up at a great speed, well, up is a good way to disappear, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, if they had came together and started revolving, I'm not sure if that would show up, especially if they're very close together. That wouldn't show up necessarily as three objects revolving together on a radar screen. It might be where they observed multiple objects coming together and making one object
Yeah,
return
no,
on the screen.
that's yeah. Back then, I don't think the radars had the resolution, so they would have definitely appeared as just one object. So
Hmm.
this witness has he talks about it again in a different way. So he has a second quote that's a little bit different. It seems like it's maybe the when he was quoted originally in the newspaper, it was sort of like they condensed what he said. He gave another statement that was a little more fleshed out, and what he said was that the lights were hovering over a road only 30 yards away, and they were about 50 feet off the ground, and he thought that they were part of the same
Huh.
object. So
Hmm.
they seem to generate the cloud. Remember how he said that they're surrounded by a cloud or a mist? but
Yeah.
he said that it seemed like the object was generating that mist, and it looked like it was folding in on itself, and it was completely silent.
Huh.
When I read this,
Sounds very sci-fi.
yeah, when I read this description, I'm just like, what the heck, man? Like it.
Yeah, that's quite a scene that he's describing.
Yeah, like, and I can't help but imagine that. So sometimes I hear about things or read about things that are from another dimension or something that exists in four spatial dimensions that's visiting our dimensions. And if that was the case, if there's a four-dimensional object existing in our three dimensions, we would probably just see a sphere, or we would only see part of that object. We would not be able to see the entire object. And for some reason, this description it makes me think of a four-dimensional object that's in our world observing us somehow. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, it does, but there's also one thing that recently I remember hearing on a documentary some guy describe his theories about what it would look like if you were on the ground observing an object that was running off of like a gravity warp type drive. I'm not going to be able to explain this type of thing to you, nor do I really understand it, but from what I've heard described, if you have a vehicle that's warping, space and time and using creating its own gravity, if you were to be physically observing it with your eyes, you may not even be able to see it at all because it's warping everything around itself, and it's kind of like using, how was it described? It's creating its own slide with this, in space and time by using gravity.
Yeah,
and kind of following a gravity distortion is kind of, like I said, I don't understand. That's a lot of freaking stuff to try to get a grasp of, but I think I kind of get what they're saying, because it's like the idea of like, if you have a black hole, well, maybe that wouldn't actually compare at all. Never mind.
I think
edit that out. I was about to make an analogy that as I was making that didn't make sense at all. Never mind.
I think one way of thinking about it is it's sort of like if you have an area of high pressure and low pressure. So, for example, the way an airplane flies is that the wing has a certain shape, and when air moves over the wing, the pressure above the wing is lower than the pressure below the wing. So because the pressure below the wing is higher, this is what causes lift. That's how airplane wings work. That's how propellers work. That's how even the blades in jet engines work, is they create a pressure differential. So one side has more pressure than the other. But so I think what basically you're talking about manipulating space-time so that instead of the object moving through space-time or just through space, you manipulate space to move around the object instead. Kind of like how an airplane manipulates air pressure so that it creates lift underneath of the wing. I think
that's a much better analogy than what I had in mind.
I don't know. Now that I said it, I'm not sure that it makes any sense, but it sounded good in my head.
No, it makes more sense. It made much more sense than what I was about to say. I'm glad I didn't say it now.
Yeah. Well, good. Then I don't have to edit it out.
Oh, okay then. Damn it. All right. So moving on. So I think it's important to note and to talk a little bit about the area that this happened in has quite a history of these type of events. One of the more famous UFO sightings that happened in England actually happened in 1980 within this area, and it also involved Air Force personnel, I believe, right?
Yeah. Also, Air Force personnel from the United States specifically, and this is the famous Britain's Roswell, aka Rendlesham Forest event, which is man, that one's a real quagmire.
Yeah, that one's an interesting case. That's for damn sure.
Yeah,
I think it's one that we'll probably touch on eventually.
Yeah,
it's interesting enough, I think.
Well, the interesting thing about that case, I don't know if you've looked into that one, but there's an actual tape recording where the deputy base commander, Colonel Halt, was chasing through the forest on foot, trying to find this UFO, and he had a tape recorder with him taping what he was saying during the incident. So he's going through, saying, "Oh my God, look at this. It's so weird," describing what he saw and all this other stuff. But it gets kind of weird because when you listen to these recordings, you can hear that. So he recorded it on one of these little handheld tape recorder things with like those little tiny tapes. I'm not sure exactly what the terminology is, but you can hear that somebody has edited this tape in a really crude fashion, basically just doing it in a room using another tape recorder, because you can like hear them talking and stuff. So what did they edit out?
That's a big red flag.
Yeah. So the Rendlesham incident is just, it's a big rabbit hole. There's just so much stuff, and we're probably going to have to do several episodes on that one. But I will say for the record that the binary code is complete and utter nonsense and has been thoroughly debunked. So if anybody is familiar with Rendlesham or they're going to look into it, you can pretty much just ignore the binary code stuff. I don't know. You know what I'm talking about there, Agent ETA?
No, to be quite honest, I'm not real familiar with the binary code we're talking about.
So one of the witnesses reported that when they touched the UFO, they got this binary code downloaded into their brain.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but
okay, yeah, no, yeah, it's
yeah. That was.
It's been a long time since I really looked into that case at all.
Yeah.
And I hadn't looked into it very, very far to begin with, but once you said that, I was like, "Oh, okay, okay." Now I remember what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that,
sorry,
they didn't do that. Or the original statements didn't mention anything about binary, and they mentioned that many years later on a television program. I think it was Unsolved Mysteries, but I might be wrong about that. But it just kind of stinks of something they invented.
Yeah. Well, and Unsolved Mysteries that show was famous for fabricating things,
Well, I'm not sure if they were or not, but somebody actually found, I'll go into more detail, but somebody actually proved that the binary code was actually just referencing specific map coordinates that was the supposed coordinates of what's called High Brazil, if you've heard of that.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. So this is what I'm talking about, dude. The whole thing,
it's off the west coast of England.
The whole Bentwaters thing, Britain's Roswell thing, you could just go on and on and on. There's so much stuff it's going to take multiple.
Well, just to explain real quick, I actually think that High Brazil would probably be a cool mind boggle, possibly. It maybe even connecting in, talking about like the Piri Reis map, without going too far on a digression.
Yeah.
People should know that High Brazil is basically a sunken island off of the west coast of England, and it's something it's a piece of land that was definitely above water during the Younger Dryas era, the last ice age, and so it's a piece of land that a lot of people are very interested about because they think it could be what inspired the stories of Atlantis.
Well, I mean, I think we could probably do like a whole episode on that kind of stuff.
Probably, yeah. Well, I mean, you could tie it in also to. Yeah, different out of place maps in history that as far as when they were supposed to have been made, the information that's on these maps shouldn't have been known.
Yeah, I mean? But well, anyways, long story short, the binary code is complete and utter BS. So just disregard it.
Yeah, well, it sounds sensational though,
Yeah, but well, that's the whole thing. But I remember actually seeing that on a TV show. At the time, this was many, many years ago, and I was really interested in the UFO topic, but I was just so disgusted at this. Like, I knew immediately when I saw it on this TV show, I'm like, dude, this is the most ridiculous thing ever. Like, binary code? Like, aliens or whoever it is, they're going to use binary code?
As we had mentioned earlier, there's multiple different types of radar, and the people who were manning these radars, they knew what they were doing. They had a lot of experience. So, Agent Anderson, would you mind expanding a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that a lot of skeptics will say to dismiss this case is that they either saw like a radar mirage or like a temperature inversion or even possibly a radar return from the moon, or, just there's all kinds of seemingly plausible explanations. But
Yeah.
when you really analyze it, if you have multiple radars that are all of different types of radars, so it's not the same model of radar, you have different types of radars, and they're all in different locations, simultaneously tracking the object. Basically, without getting into all the really nitty-gritty details, but you can pretty much rule out any sort of anomalous mirage or radar artifact or glitches in the system. When you get down to it, there was definitely a physical object responsible for these radar returns. It was not some sort of mistake or some sort of glitch or mirage.
I know I've heard the term anomalous propagation thrown around a lot when they're talking about this, right?
Yeah, that's one of the many possibilities that could cause something like this. But the thing is, when you have something like that, it doesn't usually give a strong return for a long period of time. It might give a faint return here or there, and when they describe doing like a rectilinear pattern and like it starts and stops or whatever, if you cherry pick some information and say, well, it was just random dots that the radar operator interpreted as being, a rectilinear pattern or whatever, but you really have to cherry pick that information in order to make it seem like it was some sort of mirage or false return. But when you look at the hard information and interpret the hard information, there's pretty much no possibility of it being a false return of any kind. It was definitely an object that they were getting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because of how many different angles that they're able to observe it from, basically.
Yeah, well, and just the way that radars work. And the fact that these radar operators were highly trained and they were very specialized. That's all they did was look at radars all day long. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they would know if they were getting a false return. They know what that looks like, and they know what a real airplane looks like. They know what a real return looks like.
Yeah, they had enough experience of seeing that on in a real world situation where they know what the heck they're looking at when they see something like that on the screen.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think now it's important to talk about the great Dr. Hynek.
Oh, yes. Oh, Dr. Hynek, my favorite.
The great and legendary.
The legendary Dr. Hynek. So if you're not familiar with Dr. Hynek, he was the civilian scientific adjunct researcher to Project Blue Book. And if you haven't heard about Project Blue Book, then
stop this podcast and go freaking find out about that first, please.
Yeah, it's a big one. We should probably do an episode on Blue Book eventually because
yes, absolutely.
It's pretty significant. But basically, as you might expect, because Project Blue Book, their whole thing was basically to debunk stuff, not investigate it.
Mm-hmm.
But they had concluded that it was misidentified meteors. Now, Dr. Hynek had something to say about this. Keep in mind, this is, well before he did his 180. This is what he has to say. It seems highly unlikely, for instance, that the Perseid meteors could have been the cause of the sightings, especially in view of the statement of observers that shooting stars were exceptionally numerous that evening, thus implying that they were able to distinguish the two phenomena. So what he's talking about there is a lot of the witnesses said that there were a lot of meteors that night and they saw the meteors. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen a shooting star, which but it doesn't look like what the witnesses are describing here. You would know the difference.
Yeah. Anybody who has observed a shooting star, it's obvious what it is when you're looking at it. It's following one direct path. It's acting exactly how you've always heard and how it's always been described. It's almost like I don't know, because I've living where I live, without going too far, but there's not a whole lot of pollution, so the skies are pretty clear. You get to see a lot more of the sky than you would if you were living in somewhere like any highly densely populated area. Let's just say Los Angeles. There's a lot of light pollution too. That's a big thing, but it's hard to mistake a meteor for anything else but a meteor when you're looking at it streaking across the sky.
I think that's pretty much all we have for this case. So why don't we wrap it up? Agent ETA, any final thoughts?
And my final thoughts, my opinion is that something was there, something was observed, and they weren't able to fully understand what that something was. I believe it was a UFO. I do believe it was something intelligent. And my reason for that is because of how erratic some of the patterns that these objects were following. Some of the situations would suggest, in my belief, intelligent maneuvers in nature in response to what these pilots were doing. I think there's enough there for me, at least, to conclude that they were dealing with an intelligently controlled object or craft.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's hard to make the jump to say that this was intelligently controlled, to make the jump to like aliens, because there is zero evidence that it was like aliens. But if you consider that we didn't have the technology to do that then, and we don't have the technology to do what these objects did still today, so it's hard to say that it was anything terrestrial, So even though it's hard to say that it was aliens, for me, this is one of the cases I think that is high up on the list. If you're going to say, what cases do you think best support the idea that extraterrestrials have visited us? This is up there for me. This is one of the best cases ever. Again, it's still not enough to say that it was aliens, but I think it's one of the best cases to say that it was aliens, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I'm willing to call it aliens, though.
Let's do it. It's aliens. I'm calling it. No, I didn't call it. Agent ETA called it. I'm calling it too. It's aliens.
Yes, you have been brought into my side. Come to the dark side. We have cookies.
Yeah. Cookies and beer.
Beer's good, whiskey's better.
All right. Thanks for listening. Tune in next time for a case that we haven't decided on yet.